Bitcoin is a disaster. It's going to lead to Armageddon, the end of humanity, to puppies crying, and much, much more. At least that is what you are going to believe if you listen to what's talked about in mainstream media. There are a lot of Bitcoin haters out there that say that Bitcoin and proof of work mining is going to lead to the end of all things. Bitcoin is the one thing that is going to tip us over into climate catastrophe. Oh, it's not the food system, it's not the transportation system, it's not Christmas lights or banking or gold mining or any of that stuff. Just Bitcoin is responsible. Come on, Bitcoin, what are you doing, man? In this video, I'm going to break down the criticisms that are leveled towards Bitcoin when it comes to its energy consumption, try to separate out the fact from the fiction, and debunk this common talking point that you're going to hear used a lot against Bitcoin. My name's Lark. Every day I make videos talking about cryptocurrencies. So if that's a topic you'd like to learn more about, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the thumbs up button, and of course, click on the notification bell to know when I put out a new video. So let's go ahead and turn over to it and get into this topic. Now look, the higher the price of Bitcoin goes, the more criticisms of Bitcoin you're going to hear in the mainstream media. You have stories like this one, Berkshire Hathaway's Charlie Munger out there calling Bitcoin disgusting. Ugh, Bitcoin. Warren Buffett, of course, famously also not a Bitcoin fan. Now these guys are heavily invested in the banking industry, and if you want to talk about disgusting businesses, let's talk about banks, let's talk about fraud, let's talk about how they screw their customers and rig markets and all that stuff. But I digress. Of course, these guys don't like Bitcoin. But one of the most common things we're starting to hear these days is things like how Bitcoin is an environmental disaster. You're also hearing a little bit of the stuff like Bitcoin is China coin, right? That's a geopolitical term used by certain commentators within America to paint Bitcoin as a bad, foreign, evil thing. We also hear Bitcoin now being painted sometimes as blood coin because of some of the ethical and different dramas going on inside of China. And look, there's a bit of pot calling the kettle black when we look at the politics of different countries, which is why it's better not to even go down that road. We're going to focus on the climate stuff, which is in of itself incredibly controversial with a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But we're going to look at the facts here and try and break down what's actually going on. And this climate conversation keeps coming up. We had Bill Mayer do a very, very cringy session earlier this week, slamming Bitcoin, saying that people who invest in Bitcoin are terrible people and bad for the environment and all of this stuff. A guy who's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars and flies around in private jets is lecturing you on climate change. Cool stuff. I always love to hear that. But what's actually behind this? Is there merit to the conversation of Bitcoin being a climate disaster? Well, we'll get into that exact topic. Now, by the way, if you do want to trade some Bitcoin, then I can highly recommend you do that over on Femex. It is the best Bitcoin futures exchange. You can long Bitcoin, you can short Bitcoin. They have loads of the top altcoins, Ethereum, Cardano, Polkadot, Dogecoin, if you want to trade yourself some Dogecoin. And if you sign up for Femex using the link down below in the description, you will get a 10% discount on your fees and up to $150 in trading bonuses. Now let's get into this. So Bitcoin's energy consumption index, you can see it here right now. Bitcoin is using 112 terawatts of energy per year. Now that is a lot of energy. Let's keep it real. The carbon footprint of that comparable to Singapore, the total power consumption comparable to the country of the Netherlands. So Bitcoin is using as much power as a country, a relatively power hungry country. This actually is a top 30 or top 40 power consumer if Bitcoin were a country. So that's a pretty gosh darn serious amount of electricity that is being used by Bitcoin. Now, something that's probably less talked about, but I think very equally relevant, is the electronic waste that comes out of Bitcoin. You see, Bitcoin is mined using these application-specific computers. They're basically big computer boxes that have one singular function: to mine the heck out of Bitcoin. Now, because of the highly competitive nature of the Bitcoin network, these machines, they have about an 18-month lifespan on average. Now, they're going to burn out and all these different things, but the reality is that after about 18 months, all of a sudden, unless you have dirt cheap energy, your machine is not very cost effective anymore. You need to upgrade your machine, and the old ones, because their only function was to mine Bitcoin, don't really have much of a use case anymore. So there is a lot of electronic waste coming through from Bitcoin. Obviously, some of these things can be recycled and all that stuff, but still, it is definitely part of the equation. Every act of creation is also an act of destruction. So that is something to keep in mind. Yes, there's a lot of electronic waste from Bitcoin. There's also a lot of electronic waste from just everything. So, we live in a modern society with modern things. People out there buying the latest generations of phones. How many iPhone 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s and 7s and 8s are sitting in landfills right now, just as something to think about. But yes, Bitcoin is using an incredible amount of energy. One single Bitcoin transaction uses the amount of power that could have power an average US house for around 39 days. Now that sounds pretty dramatic, obviously, and that is a lot of power. But what kind of power is being used is really, really important, because just using a lot of power is not in of itself an evil thing. If so, we should all be really upset about the power usage of Christmas lights. Those use an incredible amount of power every single year, just in the USA. But people don't get upset about that because it's seen as a general good. People like Christmas lights, makes them happy. Well, Bitcoin is useful. Bitcoin allows for centralized transactions all over the world. Bitcoin allows people to have a censorship-resistant savings account, allows them to have a hedge against the dollar, and all this kind of stuff. There are use cases for Bitcoin. If there was no use case for Bitcoin, and we were just spending all this energy on digital beanie babies, well, then, yeah, you could have that conversation. But if you are in the frame of mind that you think Bitcoin is equivalent to a beanie baby, oh man, you got some research to do, because you have no idea what the heck is going on with this technology. Now, one interesting thing that I want to point out is that Bitcoin, and look, it's hard to pin down an exact number. I've seen a lot of ranging different ideas in terms of the percentage of renewable energy that Bitcoin uses. But the most recent report by CoinShares showed that 74% of the Bitcoin network is powered by renewable energy. That's incredible. That is absolutely incredible, because if we're going to compare Bitcoin to countries, well, then let's compare Bitcoin to countries at 74% renewables. Now, I have seen other estimates, because it's very hard to know where these miners are, all of them, right? We know where some of the big miners are, what power they're using, and we can, for a relatively high level of certainty, say that a majority of the network is powered by renewable energy. But these numbers are open to a bit of interpretation, but let's take 74% as our reference point here and look at how much electricity comes from renewables by country. You see, this is really interesting, because if Bitcoin were a country, Bitcoin, for example, would be more renewable than Canada. And the United States, a country where many very prominent Bitcoin critics come from, where people like Bill Mayer live, where people like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett live, and a lot of other very outspoken Bitcoin critics live, well, their country is only run by 20% renewables. So Bitcoin is almost 4 times more renewable friendly than the United States. So again, before throwing stones, get your own house in order, guys. And because the real problem with Bitcoin energy consumption is not the fact that it's using energy, it's the fact that it's not run on 100% renewable energy. Because if it was all renewable energy, then we'd only have to talk about the e-waste problem, which would come down to a situation of better recycling issues, right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Just because some things aren't working properly doesn't mean there's not solutions to these. What you really need is to have a better functioning global renewable electricity grid. Now, if you were to compare it to a country, you'd actually see Bitcoin is much more like New Zealand. New Zealand, on average, runs over 80% of the country on renewable energy. So Bitcoin is very, very close to New Zealand in this level. So we're somewhere between Canada and New Zealand for Bitcoin in terms of its renewable energy usage. Now that is incredible when it comes down to it. When you think about how renewable Bitcoin actually is, it would be one of the world's top leading countries as a renewable energy user. So that is something to keep in mind when you hear these arguments coming up that Bitcoin is destroying the world and it's going to tip us over the edge into climate Armageddon. It just doesn't hold a lot of water because the majority of the Bitcoin network is powered by renewables, which is a very important thing for you to remember. Now, the biggest criticism is that, well, okay, maybe there's a lot of renewables, but China, come on, China, they use a lot of coal in China and stuff like that. And this is true. China does use a lot of coal, but a lot of Bitcoin mining in China actually happens in the Sichuan province, where there is a lot of hydroelectric power. Now, a lot of that power is actually excess power. So we see that power being used, not necessarily being able to be transmitted over to the big coastal cities, at least efficiently. So we do have a surplus of power in these areas where miners can come in and exploit that efficiency and use that power. And that's exactly what they do. Now, not all Bitcoin in China is produced in the Sichuan province. Recently, we had a situation with the Xinjiang province where a coal mine explosion led to a pretty big turnoff of the power grid, which saw a big hash rate crash for Bitcoin. This is a lot of coal mining power. Now, actually, China has moved most Bitcoin miners out of the Inner Mongolia region, which is, again, a coal-heavy region. But they're okay with them mining back down here in the Sichuan region, where it is a more renewable-friendly area. And if we start looking at a global level where Bitcoin is actually mined, it becomes a pretty interesting picture because a lot of Bitcoin right now, yes, China is running the majority of the Bitcoin mining, but a lot of Bitcoin is being mined in Russia, particularly out in these areas here, where we see a lot of old hydroelectric dams, for example, that are not being as used as they could be being used. And so there's a lot of surplus energy there that Bitcoin is stepping in and using. We have a similar situation happening in Georgia, where we have a lot of excess energy capacity that Bitcoin miners have been using for a long time. Georgia is actually a Bitcoin mining powerhouse and has been for some years. We see similar situations happening in Norway and Sweden. Iceland as well has been a big Bitcoin miner for a long time because it has an excess amount of renewable energy available on the grid. Now that has been probably maxed out by this point by Bitcoin miners, which is why we see, for example, the United States getting into Bitcoin pretty heavily. Canada's been doing a lot of Bitcoin mining as well, particularly, again, utilizing underused hydroelectric resources. The United States is going heavy into Bitcoin, particularly the state of Texas. We have multiple mega mines in Texas, either that have already been built or are being built, and every single one of these is running on renewables. Every single one. Most of them off of wind power, some of them doing solar power, but it's all renewable energy stuff. They're not burning oil for this. Now, there's also some companies that have been doing things like powering Bitcoin with the gas flare that happens on wells, but that's another story. It's more just using something energy-wise that was going to be wasted anyway, so that is a dirty energy source for Bitcoin, but it was already being used, so it's kind of a net neutral situation. But the mines coming in Texas, again, renewables. Bitcoin is all about renewables. Now, let's compare Bitcoin to some other industries, because that is very, very interesting. So Bitcoin, as we said, is using 112 terawatt hours of energy a year. That's a lot of energy. But what about everything else? Well, banks are using around 700 terawatts. Now I know, it's a hard comparison to make because globally banks are providing bank accounts and banking services and lending services to hundreds of millions, billions likely, of people. So it's a tough comparison to make in that way. It would be nice if Bitcoin is more efficient and could actually scale up to being able to have billions of people using the network, but we're not quite there for Bitcoin. But what about gold? Gold is the old school store of value. Well, gold uses a heck of a lot of energy. So basically, when we account for mining, jewelry, and gold recycling, we see the gold mining industry using basically twice as much energy as Bitcoin. And that is a very interesting statistic because you almost never hear anyone out there saying gold mining is destroying the world. Because here's a news flash for you. Gold mining is not run off of renewable freaking energy. Gold mining is dirty business. We're cutting down rainforests and sucking out little tiny micro fractions of gold out of the soil. It's all being done with diesel trucks, like big old giant dump trucks running on diesel. Gold mining is not an eco-friendly business by any means, but you don't hear these criticisms leveled against gold because gold is part of the establishment. It has been grandfathered in. Bitcoin, it is the disruptor. It is coming for all these banks, coming for all of these industries, the banking industry, the gold industry, because it is a better technology. Bitcoin is a better store of value than gold. Bitcoin is easier to transport than gold. It's more eco-friendly by many magnitudes than gold. Not only does it use half of the energy, but it is predominantly run on renewable energy. So the next time that you hear somebody out there trashing Bitcoin, saying that it's going to bring about climate Armageddon, tell them that they don't know what the heck they are talking about because the numbers just don't add up for that narrative. It is a BS narrative brought forward by the media intended to scare people away from Bitcoin. And look, I would like Bitcoin to be run 100% on renewables and to have a 100% rate of e-waste recycling, but we're not there yet. But when we look at what Bitcoin has done already, it is a leader in renewable energy usage. It finds inefficiencies in the energy grid and exploits them. So it's not perfect, and proof of work mining does use an incredible amount of energy, but it's a useful use of energy. The future for most networks is going to be proof of stake. Where proof of work is going to be in 100 years' time, who knows? But I think that it will likely be 100% renewable and probably have reached a much more equitable equilibrium for its energy use and not be such a monster globally in terms of how much energy it's using, because we'll have more efficient machines to run the network in the future. Anyway, those are just my 2 Satoshis. What do you think? Is Bitcoin an environmental disaster? Does the Bitcoin energy usage stop you from buying Bitcoin? Do you think this is a real issue? Do you think it's just some media BS that's drummed up to freak you out about Bitcoin? Let me know down below in the comment section. Thanks so much for watching today's video, and peace out till next time.